welcome to Dr. Lola Frost. It's an absolute pleasure to have her here, and we have in our visual politics program one of the pilot projects is on art and politics, and the people who usually do that, they are the scholars who work on art, or they are artists who are kind of interested in the scholarship, but we have very, very few people who actually do both, like Lola does, who actually artists work for a long time on art and are scholars at the same time. And of course, Lola has done very prominent art for a long time. I remember seeing an exhibition at Somerset House in London 4 or 5 years ago, maybe.
Exactly, yes.
On sort of the issue of surveillance and art and surveillance, it was absolutely fascinating. And you know, Lola is also a scholar at the same time. He's a PhD in art history, and you know, a range of sort of appointments, but also a range of really interesting scholarship, including a very interesting essay on aesthetic politics in global society in a project that I was lucky to be involved with. So given the fact that, you know, we have our already quite informal kind of seminar style here, we have about an hour. We can spend it the way that works best for you. These seminars are designed to give you feedback on a project you're working on, so I think the idea is that we'll present for about maybe half an hour, and we have a conversation around the project after that. So
well, Raymond, thank you so much. Roland, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really just quite wonderful to be here and to share this with you. I'm going to read the paper, and I'll try and do it as slowly as I can, because I tend to rush with all of these complex ideas that I struggle with. This paper I presented it last week at ANU at a workshop on art and law, and I've been delighted in Canberra to explore. It's really framed by an ongoing interest of mine in the tensions between representation and what I call aesthetic estrangement in art, which is not, that tension is not often explored. And I think it's actually it's very interesting and useful to think about those tensions. So, this painting is titled Dream Painting, and sorry, let's just also go back. Dream Painting and De-Territorializing Democratic Politics. This paper frames the emancipatory and critical potential of a performative sensorium that exceeds political representation. In so doing, it looks towards a politics and ethics of aesthetics, shaped by the tension between political and artistic representation and the practice of aesthetic estrangement in art. I do so from an internal perspective, as an artist practitioner representing what I understand to be the de-territorializing effects of my painting practice, and as a viewer of dream paintings exploring the value of their aesthetic effects. In this paper, I work from the assumption that the representations are a doing of politics in which the power effects of knowledge are cognitively, visually, or linguistically represented, disputed, elaborated, or realized. Eliza Garnsey, who was here a couple of weeks ago, in her recently published paper titled On Representations, Art, Violence, and the Political Imaginary in South Africa, has made the case that there's a close relation between political and artistic representation, as both involve a performative maneuver at work in the power-knowledge vectors that shape both art and politics. With these insights in mind, Garnsey explores the political distributions of artistic representations shown in the South African exhibition at the 2017 Venice Biennale. Illuminating for our purposes here is Garnsey's analysis of a politics of artistic representation at work in Zanele Mahole's Faces and Phases project. This is an ongoing photographic project to foreground black queer visibility on an international stage and to restore those rights enshrined by the Constitution to the LGBTQ communities in South Africa. Garnsey's paper demonstrates how multiple and layered those artistic representations are. Artists become representatives of their countries at the Venice Biennale, and ministers, as official representatives of those artistic representatives, either inhibit or promote those interventions. Mahole's images include photographic representations of LGBTQ victims, as you can see here, and the political and ethical task of this artwork is to represent and contest the repression of sexual difference, a social issue that continues to invite moral censure in South Africa and, of course, elsewhere. For artists, philosophers, and participants in what Jacques Rancière calls the aesthetic regime, the power-knowledge effects of artistic representations are not identical to a politics of aesthetic estrangement in art. For Rancière, such a politics of aesthetics is also a doing of politics that operates beyond linguistic or cognitive representation via the distributions of a shared sensorium. Artistic products and processes defined by that sensorium take their place in what Rancière calls the distributions of the sensible, to disrupt established norms and values and practices or ways of seeing, doing, and saying. Roland Bleecker questions the relation between what he calls aesthetic insights and representation, suggesting instead that the dizzying contingency, complexity, and ambiguity of aesthetic experience or insight cannot be reduced to the power knowledge demands of linguistic or visual representation. It is these or those unrepresentable sensorial distributions through which authoritative norms might be contested and negotiated that are implicit in the politics and ethics of aesthetics, of the practice of aesthetic estrangement that I sketch in this paper. I understand that this practice presumes an openness to differences and is shaped by commitments to freedom and creativity, irrespective of which medium, genre of art, style, cultural affiliation informs the artwork, or of the race, gender, or social status of the artist. Furthermore, it is the tension between the anti-representational, pluralizing, and norm-contesting contours of this practice of aesthetic estrangement and the cognitively regulating and authoritative effects of representation that this paper addresses. My painting practice is at odds with the power-knowledge effects of representation. It contests the representational authority of the tradition of sublime landscape painting. It is not a knowing expression of myself, but an aesthetic process for performing difference. It oscillates between affective resonances and ethical demands, and mobilizes that troublesome and anti-representational aesthetic category we call the sublime. But beyond such norm contestations and ethical demands, I have also developed a representational practice in which I attempt to theorize what might be involved here. In fact, I'm very attentive to that representational practice. Each of the titles of my exhibitions and projects and the poetico-philosophical representations that frame them try to catch something of the anti-representational complexity, affective energy, and the ethical contours that shape this painting practice. So, for example, the figure in this painting titled Coming Alive here could be viewed as an ecstatic, monstrous, pregnant umbilical cord abstraction that is neither a figure nor a landscape, but both. It disturbs any expectation for a spatial void, infinity, or horizon that characterizes our expectations of what a landscape painting is. Instead, this painting presents an abstract matrix shaped by the seemingly infinite proliferation of visceral, repetitive, and differentiating fractals. Likewise, this painting titled Between Here and There registers a quivering, pulsing orifice, something like a labial throat, whose inviting and radiant interior beckons inwards towards the body. Or this painting titled Going South, an assemblage of two inverted mountain cones, might be able to see them both ways, both the top and the bottom are each derived from a photograph of a mountain cone, but is realized as a floating cornucopia with its white and clitoral tongue peeping out. Derived from photographs of the landscapes of New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Argentina, and Chile, these paintings subvert the geographical and spatial vectors of the northwestern tradition of sublime landscape painting, whose immense, empty, and luminous space voids are sometimes representations of a terra incognito that arguably service the expansionist ambitions of settler occupation and, by extension, the displacement of indigenous or native inhabitants. These paintings also refigure the proper subject of the landscape, constituted by the distinctions between self, the viewing self, and the landscape, or the self and the infinitely extending void. In this painting titled Taking Risks, a self-substitute figured as, I understand is a substitute figured as a hybrid, perhaps monstrous vagina head, landscape body, peering blindly into a fog that is itself at risk of becoming enfleshed. This improper landscape body assemblage is saturated by unspeakable drives rendered legible as a form of frottage, and for me operates as a southern hemisphere Rückenfigur, or self-substitute, that delivers some sort of symbolic identity to this feast of somatic drives and affective norm contestations. This, then, is a pluralizing project that intervenes in those distributions of the sensible that have sustained the authority of the tradition of sublime landscape painting and its territorializing, individualizing, and phallocentric distributions. This norm contesting project is also situated in what Butler calls a sensate democracy, whose performative critique, according to Jenkins, must, quote, aim to open up a relation between the dominant norms that defies their presumptive status as necessary schemas for the recognition of value, end of quote. All of these paintings make claims to the virtues of dislocation, chiasmic oscillation, self-disaggregation, vulnerability, and difference, and in so doing, re-territorialize my sublime painting practice as a variation of the tradition of sublime landscape painting, but as improper, precarious, embodied, inward, subversive, ecstatic, and becoming undone. These norm contesting, or de- and re-territorializing effects extend to the inner workings, or grammar, of this painting practice, whose eventness, and I'm afraid I'm going to get quite inventive here, whose eventness, I suggest, exceeds the fixities of authoritative knowing or recognition. Each painting is initiated by a fleeting, affectively intense, and discursively disruptive event moment. For example, this painting, titled Streaming, such an aesthetic call was issued by a barreling stream after a massive downpour as we descended into the mist in Milford Sound on the South Island of New Zealand. Developing that call involved a painting process in London, in my studio, in which each carefully articulated volumetric mark line builds an assemblage consisting of drive form events. These are themselves shaped by the limitations and possibilities of transparent paints, springy brushes, energy fields, deft hands, and sharp eyes. These dynamic processes and products make aesthetic calls on the viewer. Those viewers who take up this risky challenge not only become participants in that practice of aesthetic estrangement, but are invited to negotiate the self-disaggregation, disaggregating, and ethical demands that this practice makes on them. Such disaggregating aesthetic processes, I suggest, are a starting point for a life-enhancing and transformative aesthetic liveliness that contests cognitive control and a host of other power reflexes that shape the particularities of our being in the world. Such event-based and performative norm contestation exceeds the power knowledge methods of representation, hence my strange language. Yet, aesthetic experience can also be framed to some extent by representation. I am, after all, trying to represent something of what I understand is at stake in the production and reception of my paintings. This representational supplement is not the artwork, and does not do the political, ethical, and aesthetic work that art does. It is that incommensurable adjacency between the aesthetic estranging work of the artwork and the power knowledge work of the representational supplement that I'm trying to bring into focus here. These insights are not at odds with Garnsey's claim about the close relation between political and artistic representation, involving a performative maneuver at work in the power knowledge vectors that shape both art and representational politics. But my argument here is that these comparisons not only ally the potential of those norm contestations that are made available within the practice of aesthetic estrangement, but also naturalize the normative value of power knowledge effects of representation, which is iterated across many of our contemporary practices, including practices of academic knowledge production and of democratic politics and democratic representation. So, finally, to the topic of dream painting and de-territorializing democratic politics. My questions are, how might an ethos of Aboriginal dream painting de-territorialize democratic politics? And what is at stake in an ethos of dream painting which exceeds political representation? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia have made significant headway over the last 60 years or so in challenging the legal regulations, territorial displacements and social degradations that settler colonisation and Australian representational democracy foisted on them. Ongoing contestation by these groups and communities extends to the territorial and cultural claims made by Indigenous representatives for the establishment of, quote, a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution, end of quote. This claim to Indigenous sovereignty was issued in 2017 as a statement from the heart at Uluru and was defended, quote, as a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, end of quote. That territorial sovereignty claim was the culmination of a referendum-led process of dialogue between these Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, which extended to claims about law and cultural truth-telling. Perhaps you all know, those sovereignty demands were refused by Prime Minister Turnbull in 2017. Even so, those claims continue to motivate a generative ethos of difference for Aboriginal communities, whose premier practice of dream painting can also operate as a representation or sign of those aspirations. Here, an ethos of Aboriginal dream painting intervenes in those distributions of the sensible by de-territorializing democratic politics. I'm suggesting then that in the absence of sovereign Aboriginal political representation in Parliament, dream painting takes its place as a representation for and valorization of Aboriginal difference in a multicultural representational democracy. That representational success, as Bleeker and Butler have argued, was also inadvertently a product of Australian cultural diplomacy, when the Australian government's instrumentally purposed exhibitions of Aboriginal art in the US in 1941 and 2009 backfired to some extent to illuminate not only the injustices that Aboriginal people suffered in Australia, but also the aesthetic significance of that practice of dream painting to an international audience. The authority and international reputation of Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander dream paintings that has emerged over the last 70 years or so is also celebrated by the Australian National Gallery in Canberra as one of its premier exhibits. Like others who make claims for the modernist or avant-gardist character of this genre, I understand that these dream paintings are not only the bearers of a sophisticated practice of aesthetic estrangement that speaks to an ancient tradition of painting, but also responds to the demands and challenges of the present. Representationally, such success is also a consequence of the representational efforts of Indigenous peoples themselves and of the representations of others interested in recuperating and promoting this artistic tradition and in contesting the racialized denigration of these groups and communities. According to Jennifer Biddle, dream painting is a performative, life-affirming practice shot through by complex affective responses that are shaped by specific, quote, practice-based modalities of collaborative process and assembly that require completion through encounter, end of quote, and which are also open to internal social contestation. Here are subtle politics and ethics of aesthetics, realized as a performative and relational sensorium, plays its de-territorializing part at the interface of Aboriginal and Australian democratic politics. Informed by that performative and relational sensorium that the Biddle describes, dream painting services not only those claims to territory and cultural sovereignty, but is a valued and partly funded aesthetic practice that has reintroduced cultural agency and value to those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders whose life chances were damaged by that long trajectory of colonial degradation, democratic erasure, and representational injustice. What is then at stake when an ethos of dream painting exceeds such patently valuable and productive political representation? Even if the Aboriginal sign of dream painting, and I haven't talked about this, but its settler counterpart, the Australian War Memorial's Myth of the Nation, are part of an extra-parliamentary politics and ethics of cultural representation, the aesthetic value of that ethos of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander painting, we might all agree, lies elsewhere, beyond such representation. The success of Aboriginal dream painting, I understand, delivers its own performative version of a life-affirming ethics by its own event moments as a practice of aesthetic estrangement. Here, such life-enhancing, co-relational and affectively attuned methods of painting deliver artworks whose aesthetic subtlety and complexity are masterclasses. I cannot do justice to my experience of some of these artworks on show in the Australian National Gallery in Canberra. A few little framings will have to do. David Chapulchari's Woman's Dreaming painting caught my attention because of its inward embodied references, whose exquisitely poised affective articulations, as in many dream paintings, are realized as dot events which sparkle and shimmer. The same disruptive ecstasy events shaped Doreen Nakamura's Untitled, where these line surfaces and shimmers register as perhaps landscape skins. Nata Nogaranye and George Chapulchari's Untitled Abstractions pulse with ecstatic energies, delivering a sublime experiences that is not predicated on the distinctions between self and spatial extension, but on ecstatic play and cosmic affective interrelation. As performances of aesthetic risk, Paddy Bedford's Untitled frames a momentary experience of desolation, whereas Jack and Lily Caradada's Untitled paintings register as unrepresentable sedimentations of trauma, vulnerability, suffering, and loss. The title of James Taylor's Ayatoras Mahawaiki and its supplementary text frames these compelling ripped in half images of mountains, trees, and clouds. Here, the artist's hybrid Aboriginal, Maori, and European identity is folded into a description of this artwork as a contestation of colonization and a reclamation of origin. Taylor's artwork thus registers a new regime for Aboriginal dream painting, one which to some extent requires linguistic representational confirmation of the experience of aesthetic estrangement. So, in conclusion, in exploring the tensions between the power-knowledge effects of representation and that practice of aesthetic estrangement, I have made a case for a sensorial politics and ethics of aesthetics embedded in both my painting practice and in Indigenous dream painting. Even if artistic and democratic representations, whose several benefits include legislating and distributing the effects of power across diverse populations, of framing and supplementing art practices, and distributing, encoding, producing new knowledge, those authorizations, privileges, and knowledges are not necessarily equally distributed and may also be discriminatory. The benefit of that practice of aesthetic estrangement are that it is available to those participants who may not have access to democratic or legal representation, or may not be able, or choose not to, mobilize the power-knowledge effects of representation. Such participants may sense that living an ethical life also involves habiting the pluralities of aesthetic experience, and that the aesthetic risks of that norm-contesting practice of aesthetic estrangement involves being open to differences. Such aesthetic risk-taking does not preclude recognizing the precarities of our mutual co-constitution and the realization of an individual's agency or of a group's shared values. It is the transformative and critical potential of such a performative sensorium, or what Butler calls a sensate democracy, located in and distributed by artworks and practices of art, that I hope to have made the case for here. Can the emancipatory potential of that challenging and life-affirming practice of aesthetic estrangement be more fully realized as a result of legal or democratic representation? How might scholarship contribute to that process? Or are aesthetic estrangements necessarily too obliquely performative, affectively slippery, and norm-contesting for our representationally oriented social and political arrangements? Thank you.